What's up, my channel? It's your friendly neighborhood sassy blonde writer coming at you with a writing video. Today we are going to be talking about reboots, revivals, and remakes. What are they, and how do you write them? Last time we were here, we were talking about fanfiction writing and how there are some completely legitimate and very lucrative ways to tell stories that have their roots in fanfiction. So today we are talking about some of those. 3 of those. Originally it was just going to be 2, but reboots and revivals are pretty similar, so we're just gonna talk about revivals briefly. So the reason why I want to talk about them together is because while they do fall under the umbrella of things that you can do to a franchise that is a legit form of fanfiction, these 2 forms refer specifically to basically any type of media other than a book. The formal definitions of both of them apply to movies, TV shows, and video games, and that type of media, not so much books, whereas the other ones that I was originally going to talk about, like retellings and adaptations, don't apply to those. So like we said before, a franchise is a collection of related media based around different types of works. So you have Avatar: The Last Airbender, Gilmore Girls, Call of Duty, Fallout, Marvel, etc., etc. A franchise specifically usually has a huge fan base or following, and oftentimes the creation usually takes on a life of its own. Reboots and remakes have some similarities, and a lot of times these terms are used interchangeably. And one of the things I found in some of my research that I did is that about 75% of the sources use the term correctly. Those sources get really upset about the other types of sources that use terms interchangeably. They do have some similarities. For example, most of the time they are done by bigger companies or big studios. This is especially true when it's a movie franchise. A lot of times reboots are done within the same company that they were originally made. So without further ado, let's dive on in. The definition of a reboot is a restart of an entertainment universe that has already been established. Think the sequels of Star Wars that took place almost 10-20 years after the last prequel was made. Something is usually considered a reboot and not just a sequel when it's been, from what I can tell, about a decade is where the standard is from when it stops being a sequel and becomes a reboot. Usually sequels come out within 5 years of the original movie. For TV shows, it's the last episode of the original series happened. Here, we're gonna go over the details in a little bit. So the thing about a reboot is a reboot typically takes the same universe and creates a new story within that pre-existing universe. And a lot of times they have new characters, they have new people, and they have usually a time jump involved. Sometimes you get to catch up with the old characters as well in a reboot, like what happened in the Star Wars sequels, calling them, because we all know it was the Star Wars reboot. But sometimes a reboot can also be called a revival. They're used pretty interchangeably. A revival specific to TV shows, specifically when the TV show basically picks up where it left off the last time. That usually happens when a TV show is abruptly ended, like think Twin Peaks season 2. It just ends. Nobody's questions are answered. Nobody understands what's happening. Detective Cooper possessed by the evil spirit. Who knows what's going on? They just ended the series. Nobody got any sense of closure. Then like 30 years later, they did a reboot / revival, and the reason why it was a revival was because it essentially just picked up where the old one left off. That's the difference between a revival and a reboot. Like a revival is a specific type of reboot, so a revival just kind of takes place with the old series left off, so you have the same characters, the same universe, just like moving forward. So that's also like what happened in Doctor Who 2005, where it was restarting the franchise, where it was just picking up where the original left off, or it was restarting the franchise but with the same cast and the characters going on new adventures, like in Gilmore Girls: A Year in the Life. Usually with a reboot, story takes place, like I said before, same universe as the old one, but with new characters as the original characters are all grown up. Same universe, new story. In the case of Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, they went sort of the opposite direction. Normally with reboots, there's like a time jump to the future. Fantastic Beasts, they did the opposite, where they went time jump to the past, whatever. Either way, the same thing stands. Same universe, new story. It can be really daunting when you're trying to write a reboot. It's like the feeling you get when your first book does really well, or your first writing of anything does really well, and everyone's like, okay, write another one, and you're like, I have to do better than that? It's an interesting problem with a reboot specifically, because you know that the fans are pretty loyal, especially for the first reboot. You know that they'll probably go watch at least the first one. So that's sort of nice, you have a built-in audience. But the problem is that fan bases, especially the older and more established they are, can be very vocal about what they like and dislike that you do in reboots. And they can also feel entitled to having input on everything from casting choices to plot development. Very interesting how fan bases work, especially when a reboot is happening. A lot of times writers can have a lot of pressure. The best way to write a good reboot is if you're a fan of whatever you're writing a reboot of already. Part of the reason why the Star Trek reboots with Chris Pine as Captain Kirk, part of the reason why those were so successful was because the person who originally made the movies was already a fan of Star Trek, so he already knew this stuff inside and out, so he had a vision for it as a fan already, so then it kind of drew in other fans who were like-minded. If you are a fan already, chances are you probably already know what fans want, or at the very least, you understand why the fans enjoy the franchise, what they love about it. And take what they love about it and make sure you incorporate that into the new one, and then you can just kind of go with your gut as a writer. And you have to find the best way to transform it for a newer audience. So a pro to a franchise reboot is that you already have an established franchise, you already have an established fan base. So it's pretty easy to get people to sign on for rebooting it because it's like, oh yeah, cool beans, sounds good. Like, people already love this. Yeah, great, easy. Let me write you the check right away. This is especially easy if you were working with the people who originally created it. Like, you were coming in as a separate person, but you're already working with the people who created it originally. That's just gonna make your life a lot easier because then they're gonna give their seal of approval and it's gonna be great. A con is that a reboot can often look like a cash grab because of the gotta have a sequel mentality of Hollywood. Even a movie that really should have been a standalone is usually pressured to have a sequel for no reason. So audiences usually are skeptical. I know I personally get skeptical when they reboot a franchise. I'm like, but like, is this gonna be good? But as long as you keep it original, you usually don't run into problems. So that is another con, is that a lot of times a reboot can turn into a remake, and I'm gonna get into what a remake is in a little bit. Like in Star Wars Episode 7, where it's another Death Star, and we find another kid on a desert planet who is even lonelier than the first, and he finds a droid. And it was basically the same plot as Episode 4, A New Hope. So, fans will be disappointed because they thought they were getting something new, but then they got the same movie that they already saw. And as long as you keep the plot original, people will be fine. Don't just rip off one of the previous movies for the reboot. That's probably one of the biggest pieces of advice. Don't just rip off a plot from a previous movie. Do something original. There you go. Now on the other side of things, you have remakes. A remake is a production of film, television series, video game, or similar forms of entertainment that is based upon an earlier production. A remake tells the same story as the original but uses a different cast and may alter the theme or target audience. So remakes have become really popular in Hollywood recently. It's like we ran out of new stories to tell, so we just keep remaking the old ones. It's really weird. So remakes for each different type of media are slightly different, and a lot of times they repeat the same story, but when you repeat it, you change like one or two things, maybe. So I'm going to go into a little bit detail about that, on how that works for movies, TV shows, and video games. More details on what a remake is. So Disney is doing a lot of live action remakes of their old animated fairy tales. So they have the same plot as the fairy tales, right? Same plot as the animated fairy tales, sometimes same songs, but then they change up a couple of things. They change up one, that they're not animated anymore, that they're live action. Another example is the movie A Star is Born has been remade a lot of times. I know it came out a couple years ago with Lady Gaga. In movies, the remake usually repeats the same basic story from the original film, and a lot of times it includes the same title. Sometimes you get the same director remaking a movie that they already made. Alfred Hitchcock did that because he's an egomaniac. Essentially directed the same movie twice and then released 2 different versions of it. I think he released them under 2 different names, but like whatever. So usually it has the same basic story as the original film, but there's usually a notable plot and story elements that indicate that the 2 films are set in the same like universe. So they're usually slightly different, and I'll go into more detail about that when we get into the pros and cons, because it's a lot easier to explain with specific examples. TV shows, when they do a remake, there were actually a lot of recent examples in the early 21st century. In the early 2000s, we just loved TV show remakes. So you had shows like Hawaii Five-0 that were remade with the same storyline and the same characters, and even some episodes were like shot-for-shot remakes of the original show from the 70s. This is also really common with American remakes of foreign TV shows. Probably the most recent example is the US sitcom The Office, which ran from 2005 to 2013, which was a remake of a 2001 BBC sitcom of the same name, so that is important to note. It's also very common in video games. Remakes are often made by the original developer or copyright holder, although sometimes they're made by the fan community. And so a remake of a video game usually just modernizes the game for newer hardware. Pretty common, especially with computer games. So like an example of that is Resident Evil 2, which was remade in 2019. It needed to be updated just because technology got better, so the game was not aging well. The graphics, I saw the original game, the graphics were rough. So sometimes this is also called in video games remastered as well, where they usually, again, they don't change the plot of the game, they just update the game itself so that way it can run on newer hardware. One of the pros of doing a remake is that you get to put your own spin on an original. So for example, Sofia Coppola did this when she did a remake of The Beguiles a couple of years ago. The Beguiles was a Civil War era tale about Corporal John McBurney, who flees battle after suffering an injury and is taken in at a southern all-girls school that is isolated from the war. So the 1971 version with Clint Eastwood is mostly focused on the man and his decision to be in an all-girls school, and it was focused on his side of things because it was a movie with a male lead, and it was directed by a man, and it was based off of a book that was written by a man. So it made sense that it focused on the soldier. When Sofia Coppola did her remake, however, she decided to focus on the women in the all-girls school, who were pretty much isolated from the war that was happening, and they hadn't really seen the man in a while. So they focused on that side of things. Another way you can put your own spin on doing a remake is changing one part of the original, like the time period. So for example, you have a 1932 Scarface, which was remade in 1983 starring Al Pacino, and the 1932 version was about illegal alcohol trade, while the characters in the 1983 version were cocaine smugglers. And this shows that times may have changed, but people have not. Con with doing a remake, however, is that people will always compare it to the original, and that's just a fact that you have to do. It's like doing a cover of a really well-known song. The other thing is, if you do it the same exact way that the original did it, what was the point? This is especially common with movies, and you do it like a shot-for-shot remake of the original. What was the point? Maybe to like update special effects, but other than that, what was the point in any of this? But if you stray too far from the original, then did you really do a remake after all? It's a fine line to walk. This is especially common when people try to remake horror movies. If it's a campy horror movie, and where it was originally like a B-list horror movie and it was super campy or like so bad it's good, and they remake it and they have it take itself too seriously, that it's just like, no, that's not funny, I don't want to watch this. They either take themselves too seriously, where the original did not, like with RoboCop, or they focus on the wrong parts of the story. Another con to consider is if the original holds up to today's standards, like when they tried to do a remake of Charlie's Angels. Like, when Charlie's Angels first came out, it was one of the few female-led TV shows out there, so it was a really big deal. However, so it was a really big deal back in the 1970s. But when they tried to reboot it, in like 2011, and one of the issues was the show's premise was really dated. So the show flopped, also for other reasons. Like, another issue can be that the concept just isn't as groundbreaking as it was at the time, like with The Odd Couple, where, like, when they tried to reboot The Odd Couple a couple of years ago with Matthew Perry, and it's just like, and it didn't do that well because the show can be as funny as it wants, but the idea of two people who are polar opposites living together just isn't that nuanced for a modern audience. It's just not that big a deal to us anymore. We see that all the time. So how do you make a reboot or a remake? Now, I'm not a lawyer. With both of these options, you need to get the rights. When you're making a remake, you need to make sure that you obtain the rights to the script. For a remake, it's a little bit easier than when you're doing a reboot because you generally just have to track down whoever has the rights to the original script or screenplay, and you just have to get the rights to that, as opposed to a reboot where you usually have to work with whoever holds the copyright or the whoever has the intellectual property, or in certain franchises, in a certain company's case, just make enough money to buy the intellectual property so you can just do whatever you want with it. So that's also a completely valid option. If you don't work to obtain permission from the creators or the franchise or obtain the rights, they can and they will go out. So just to review, a reboot, same universe of an established franchise, new story. A remake, same story with some new elements. That's all I have for you today, folks. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want more content like this, please hit that like button. And what's your favorite example of a reboot or a remake? Or are you not a fan of this? It's okay if you are. Let me know in the comments below. I look forward to what you have to say. Make sure you remember to subscribe. I post new videos on Wednesdays. And of course, happy writing.